Okay, well, welcome. It's 1930, and as you know, we're in Japan, so we start on time. Thank you for the penultimate session of the year. Next week we have the director of the movie Cut, who will end our year with a cultural aspect. But today we're not dealing with culture, we're dealing with war. And peace, war and peace. Well, Tolstoy, that's kind of culture too. So I'm extremely happy to have Garren. He combines both academic experience, he served in the armed forces, and like a lot of civilians like myself who are interested in the military, but whose service consists of reading books. So he actually knows what it is to be in uniform. And he's been working for quite a long time studying Japan's peacekeeping operations and different types of overseas dispatch operations. So he will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have our usual hour of discussion. So brevity is a sort of wit. So for me, that is, as the person introduces, not for you. You're supposed to speak and actually not only have wit, but put some time. So the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me?
And if you didn't get an invitation from us directly, just give us your business card.
Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear without me actually holding a mic. Is that okay? Yeah, Garren Mulloy, Bunker University, and we're looking here at effective international actors.
Sure. That's okay, people can hear you. If they can't hear you, they can see you.
Yeah. And actually, earlier on, I was thinking I was extremely popular because the room was full, and now that room's opened out. I feel like a failure. So, if you don't mind hearing a presentation from a failure, I don't mind giving it. So, a few things to run through first. I have lots of slides, and it's going to be a battle to get them done within 30 minutes. I will jump through some things, skip past. Don't worry. Basically, this is a very condensed version of my PhD thesis, which has then been expanded again to include 21st century operations. So this is my reason for going quickly and jumping through. Right, structure presentation. I hope it's not too dull. It is pretty dull, but it's a sort of academic presentation. Questions and parameters, excellent research, definition, methodology, operational analysis, immediate findings, which are rather detailed points, and then the broader findings. What is the broader meaning of all of this? Okay? But first of all, I'm a teacher. Therefore, we're going to have a quiz. So I thought we'd start with a quiz. Now, this is all on a show of hands basis. So, where was the first Japanese post-war overseas dispatch operation?
Korean War.
Congratulations. Everyone else says
one Japanese died.
One Japanese died on MS-14, Minesweeper 14. Not many people know that. Thank you, Robert. You know all. So, yes, Korean War. Minesweepers were dispatched from Japan. Second question, where was the first JSDF ODO? Walter?
Africa?
No. First JSDF overseas dispatch operation.
Kampuchea?
No, not Cambodia, Cambodia, no. That was the first peacekeeping operation. Now, most people think Cambodia, Kampuchea, and then there's a silence like we have now.
Kuwait?
Almost. It was the Persian Gulf. Because in 1991, the MSDF, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, dispatched minesweepers to the Persian Gulf. It was big news, huge news in Japan. But because the next year they dispatched forces to Cambodia, most people have forgotten it. It's incredible. Third, does Japan do peacekeeping? This is a yes/no answer. Who says yes? Who says no? The answer, of course, is no. You may be surprised at that. Don't be too surprised. Next question is not a yes/no answer. Why does Japan send JSDF on overseas dispatch operations? Yes.
To get a seat on the Security Council.
That's a good answer.
International pressure.
Good answer.
To avoid the criticism of Japan force checkbook diplomacy.
Okay, checkbook diplomacy after the Gulf War. That's a good one. Any other? Of course, the true answer is I don't have a clue. I've got guesses. I've got guesses, like your guesses. All of those are relevant. They really are. But I don't know. I really don't know. But we think this is a unique Japan situation. It's not. Most countries do peacekeeping without any particular formed, cogent reason for doing it. Anyway, we're going to move on. Questions and parameters. These are the obvious questions to ask. What are the operations? How and why were they selected? What did the JSDF actually do? How did they perform? How did performance affect the JSDF? How did JSDF culture and configuration affect performance? Were the JSDF effective international actors? It's the last question which I'm particularly concerned about. Extant research. I know some of you are academics, some of you are not. All I'm saying is there is a general body of extant research which is concerned with general matters. These are important for understanding the context, but of a limited applicability for understanding operations. Actually, what happened, where and when, and how performance was. The specific literature in the field is extremely limited. A lot of it is journalism. It is very, very narrow case specific. There's very little comparison between missions, and there's a large body of peacekeeping literature, the success or failures of peacekeeping missions. But again, they look at missions. They don't look at one actor in multiple missions. The Japanese government and self-defense forces themselves have a body of literature. Most of it is not in the public domain. The Hakenshi, the dispatch histories, are not in the public domain, and what is in the public domain really isn't that useful. Now, definition of terms. PKO. We often talk about PKO, the PKO law. Japan does PKO. Right. Japan does not do PKO. What Japan does is a version, a developed variant of PSO. I'll go into these later. PSO is Peace Support Operations. Now, most operations that Japan has done are not PKO, PSO, PKF. They are other types. And Japan is the only country I've found, after 14 years of research, that differentiates between PKO and PKF. The O is operation, the F is force. And because of the sensitivities connected with the constitution and the legal situation, Japan is the only country that differentiates between the O and the F. Don't ask me why. We'll get to that later. Definition of terms. Sorry, this looks complex. It isn't terribly complex, but the main point is, Boutros Ghali, in his Agenda for Peace, he defined or differentiated 5 forms of peace operation, which I'll go into later. The Brahimi report only identified 3. There is a problem here. Japan likes the Brahimi side because it's doing peacekeeping. But actually, this is a problem. Because if you look at PMO and PBO, they're the extremes, they're the largely non-military parts, they're fine. PKO, PSO, and PEO. Japan does PSO. It does really good work, PSO. But legally, it cannot do most of the functions of PKO, and it is absolutely forbidden to even consider PEO. So the differentiation between PKO, PSO, and PEO is actually rather important. People brush over this quickly. It isn't something to be taken lightly. This is very important. So I came up with the expression of overseas dispatch operations because the Japanese expression is Kokusai Heiwa Kyōryoku Katsudo, which is international peace cooperation activities. But it is the term audio, I hope, is fairly neutral. It covers UN and non-UN operations, and most operations are non-UN that Japan has done. Unilateral and multilateral operations, and the IPCA term and the IPCA law was actually developed from ODA policies, official development assistance policies, in the 80s. So it's quite a continuation of the language that's used in both of the laws. And most ODO is overseen by the International Peace Cooperation headquarters within the Cabinet Office, where both JSDF and police in operations work as members of the International Peace Cooperation Corps, IPCs. Sorry, I am dealing with military issues, therefore everything is an acronym. So nothing is actually real English. So the thing that is simple and easy to understand is that in terms of policy and operations, these are the main actors. MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Gaimsho, is at the top. They believe they are at the top. They're the ones who essentially try to set the agenda, and quite rightly so. Quite rightly so. We'll get onto the MOFA issues later, but obviously the Cabinet Office and the International Peace Cooperation Headquarters is extremely important. It's a central, it is a central body, but it doesn't have command and control functions. People often misunderstand. It's a coordinating, a servicing agency. It doesn't have command and control. The Ministry of Defence as it is now, before the JDA, the Japan Defence Agency, and the JSDF, of course, deal with the main part of ODO, which is military side or uniform side. National Police Agency, NPA, and the police. This is a disappointment. They do international peace cooperation activities, but their experience in Cambodia in 1993 was so bad. One of their officers was killed and 4 were injured. Their experience was so bad that never again have they sent units out. So the difference of experience in ODO between the MOD, JDA, JSDF and the police is so different. JSDF is seen as successful, police is seen as essentially a failure. Now, we come to Article 9 of the Constitution. You don't have to read it, you don't have to write it down. The main part is underlined. Land, sea and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The Constitution was originally written in English, which leads us to an interesting point. The underlined part in Japanese doesn't use the word force or butai, it uses the word gun. Riku, kai, ku, gun. So, if you look at the English version of the Constitution, you think, the J-Tai's position is looking a bit strange. If you look at the Japanese version, you say, they're okay. This is a problem. It is a problem because, by the way, this next slide, if you really do not understand, if you think it feels like a psychedelic experience, don't worry, it's intended to. There's a fear of clouds and codes. Now, in Japan, there is an implicit code. It's it's a code. The code is based upon perceptions of interpretations of a translated document, the Constitution. It's perceptions of interpretations of the Constitution which was translated. The code is not codified. It's not written down anywhere. The code hangs above everything and all of us like a cloud. The code or cloud affects laws, policies, and operational decisions. This is where it gets serious. And the code or cloud is imaginary. And it's also very real. And it exerts a tremendous influence. It might sound like some strange concoction of mine, and it is. But the code is real. And the code is the interpretation, the perception of interpretations of a constitution that was translated. There's always a fear of overstepping the code, of being in breach of it. Now, methodology operational analysis. For academics, this is always very important, but I think for most of you it's probably quite dull. I've attempted a triangulation of JSDF and non-JSDF UN operations and other operations outside the UN, together with non-Japanese actors. Analytical framework looks at those 4 points of the context, preparation, performance, and mission contribution. And the operational analysis, I've used 3 performance indicators of effectiveness, efficiency, and quality. The problem with the excellent literature can be clearly seen by the fact, the reference here, the only performance indicator that was useful for operations I could find was not military, it was police. And it was a PhD thesis. There is almost nothing in the excellent literature that could be used as a basis for my research, much to my disappointment. So, methodology operational analysis, essentially, when we're looking at the JSDF, there is no systematic analysis of operations, certainly in the 1990s. Today, it is getting better. There's a distinct lack of documentation. Most of the documentation is uncritical and non-specific. Japan actually has a very small security community, very small, and my research was interview-based, and therefore it is somewhat limited. I, of course, used the documentation that I could, and media resources are also limited. Most media are not very interested in the JSDF, and I think they should be. Okay, methodology and operational analysis, we're looking at ODO of the 1990s. The JSDF, sorry. I'm not a member of the JSDF. carried out 3 operations for the UN in the 1990s, the largest, of course, being in Cambodia. The Garren operation is perhaps the most interesting in that since it started in 96, 15 years, it's become a kind of training school for peacekeeping. Very interesting. Non-UN operations, Allied support, as I mentioned in the Persian Gulf, humanitarian assistance operations, Rwanda Zaire was the biggest, and the first disaster relief, the Kim Kyu-Chien operation in Honduras in 98. So the UN operations, there was a UN command, PSO nature, nation building, classical operations. The non-UN operations were very varied, strongly liberal with an international peace cooperation character to them. The 21st century operations have continued that stream. People think there was a big jump with Iraq. But actually, if you look at operations of the 90s and the 21st century, there's a huge amount of continuity. Not a big change. You've got the UN operations listed up, and the latest one is UNMISS, which is in South Sudan, which is going to take place, the Japanese will join from the end of January next year, I believe. And the non-UN operations, of course, they're broadened out. Anti-terrorism operations, so-called, is, Operation Enduring Freedom Maritime Interdiction Operation. Trips off the tongue, doesn't it? What it essentially means is the MSDF sailing around the Indian Ocean, refueling themselves and the navies of other nations who were apparently trying to find terrorists. The US, CIA, and the National Security Agency, they put out a joint report which said 95% of weapons go through Karachi port. So I thought it'd be better to sail around in Karachi port, personally, but that's just me. Allied support operations, Iraq, very big one. People think Iraq is very different from the 90s, but it's actually much more of a continuation than you might think. Gulf of Aden and Djibouti. The Djibouti operation, the Gulf of Aden anti-piracy Djibouti operation. Djibouti is very different because it is a standing base outside of Japan. It's not a training base, it's a standing operational base outside of Japan. That's a very important development. I think a very positive one. Refugee relief, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Jordan. And disaster relief, again, the Thailand, Indonesia was after the 2005 earthquake and tsunami. So again, the UN operations, we're looking at the pattern of the 90s, and in the non-UN operations, a continuation and a slight broadening of patterns. But some immediate findings, operational analysis, looking at some common issues. Generally, except for disaster relief, where they are quick, most JSDF ODO are slow deployment with significant logistical limits, particularly in air transport, which we'll look at later. There are also legal and political obstacles. The IPCL, the International Peace Cooperation Law, is umbrella legislation. Most cases, a separate law is required, although there are exceptions where cabinet orders can be used. JDA or MOD, MSDF, Management and Culture, there still is to a degree, that there was a rotation of responsibility between area armies and the JSDF. So essentially for 18 months, if there's any peacekeeping operation, it went from one army. It wasn't based on specialization, special skills, it was just, it's your turn, you do it. It was another duty, that wasn't good. It meant that expertise wasn't actually fostered. There was poor joint working between the 3 JSDF, and that, to a degree, is still the case, but it has improved. And there's a cultural problem as well, that some parts of the JSDF see peacekeeping and overseas deployment as a distraction from their real work, which is defending Japan, naturally so. Poor local intelligence. Japan does not have good intelligence sources generally. And also defense investment legacies and policies. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail later. There are other things as well. The IPCL limits a maximum of 2,000 personnel, which seems like a lot, but you've got to remember that if you send 600 to Cambodia, you have a rotation. So that means at the same time, you've got 1,200 in Cambodia. That counts within the total. So you have to be very careful when you're planning operations. If you're sending out naval forces, you have to have the rotation of naval forces, the crews of both ships. All of these things need to be thought through. Mission requires separate legislation, as I've said, ad hoc units, and to some degree, before 1998, there was what is being described by one researcher as an Alice in Wonderland approach to unit security. And that includes ROE, rules of engagement, and equipment. I'll talk about that in more detail later. Okay, sorry, I am Choto Gunji Otaku. So we are looking at the Gunji Otaku, the military nerd in me is coming out. This is the number of air transport aircraft available to Britain and Japan in 2006. As you can see, the balance within Japan, tactical means within the country essentially. Short range, relatively short range. Strategic means very long range. The British capacity is essentially focused upon European and outer operations. Japan is very much focused on internal operations. Okay? Canada, Australia, again, the balance is more similar to the British than it is to the Japanese model. And here we have ships. Now, sea lift is a big issue in peacekeeping operations and other operations, particularly when you have heavy engineering equipment or armoured vehicles. Essentially, Japan has 3 vessels, 2006 this is, 26,000 tons, and you look at the British case on the side there. But also, it's very important to look at auxiliary support vessels. It's not just how much you can move, it's how you can support operations like AOE, which are fast replenishment vessels like tankers plus dry goods. Japan has 4 of this tonnage. UK has 12 that can be used in this role for that amount of tonnage. What it means is that Japanese forces, land, sea and air forces, the investment has gone into very much frontline equipment. Aegis destroyers, jet fighters, tanks, artillery. It's very much front-loaded from an operational perspective. It means that the forces appear very strong, but the ability to actually sustain operations, such as the Indian Ocean operation, it was limited not by the numbers of destroyers, but by the numbers of tankers and their crews. The crews require training, the ships require refits. This is always a big point. Okay, I'm running short of time already, sorry. I'll jump that because I'm short of time. Okay, some common issues. Slow deployment we've said, but the poor risk assessment and management in first generation ODO. Essentially, this is something of a mystery. At the policy level, politicians in Japan are highly risk averse in form and function. They don't want to risk anything or anyone. However, in operations, there was poor risk reduction management, which I'll talk about a bit later. And there was an implicit reliance upon collective security. At the same time, there was an explicit rejection of collective security. You don't have to be a genius to see there's a slight problem here. Okay? And there was, I go back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFA, Gaimsho. Gaimsho, in their assessments of locations for potential operations, would often say, yes, they've got a peace agreement, it's safe, it's fine, you can go there. And the JSDF would turn up, and it's not exactly safe, it's not exactly fine. This is a point of contention. Watanabe, General Watanabe was the commander of forces in the first rotation in Cambodia. Just, we're short of time, but what is basic common sense for the militaries of nations taking part in PKOs is not recognized by Japan. I think that says a lot. Inadequate preparations and follow-up. There was very little operational specific training in the 1990s. This has changed from 1998. It has become much better, but still, it could be far better indeed. And follow-up, lessons learned, really until 2007 was extremely poor. It was not systemized. There were people who I interviewed. They went to Cambodia, they went to East Timor, they came back home. I asked them, were you ever debriefed?